quickly. The fund is very, very popular, of course, uh, and everybody would like a piece of the cake, so it's a lot of competition from within. Uh, it limits the opportunities if we can't get the proper funding. Well, as you explained quite clearly, it's an important priority because it will, in fact, support continued development of our economy. And I would like to thank you very much, and I'll do my best to convince my colleagues to get behind it as well. Thank you very much.
And now over to MP Davies. This will be the last questions for our witnesses.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Dr. Singh, the CAPHD has said they'd like clarification on how healthcare providers can coordinate benefits for individuals eligible under more than one public insurance. That means federal, provincial, or territorial plan. You said that's essential to streamline the process for providers and ease the financial burden for eligible individuals, which aligns with the CAPHD's preference for minimizing out-of-pocket expenses for patients. It's my understanding, Dr. Singh, that the federal government is in active negotiations with the provinces that likely will make the federal government the first payer, and then if there's a social services program, that the persons on the province or territory will be the second payer. In your view, would that be an acceptable coordination of benefits?
I would think so. Yes, if there's better alignment and better understanding along with the communication and clarity, that would help.
Finally, you have also said that it's important that this plan remain responsive to the evolving needs of Canadians. Can you basically give us an idea of the kind of data we should be collecting or what we should be looking for to make sure that this plan remains responsive and, in fact, maybe becomes even better?
Right. I think this includes diverse range of metrics, including from what areas people are coming to receive service from and where. So I think I'd be most interested personally to also see if people living in their home communities are able to receive services right where they are. So data related to that, data related to income levels, socioeconomic status, and how much people paid out of the pocket, because I know there are income categories based on which the copayment is decided. So evolving data on that would also be helpful for future directions as to if there is hesitancy for patients to accept treatment based on the out-of-pocket expenses, or this is seen as a positive and more people are receiving the care that they need.
Thank you, MP Davies. And we want to thank our witnesses, Dr. Singh, Monsieur Labarge. Thank you very much for your testimony on behalf of our Finance Committee. We really appreciate it. And we are going to be transitioning now to our final panel for the day. So we'll suspend and get those witnesses in as quickly as we can. We are here with our final panel for today, and we have with us Associate Professor, Sprott School of Business, Carleton University, Mr. Ian Lee, who's no stranger to this committee. As well, we have from the Canadian Association of Public Health Dentistry here in person, the immediate past president, which is Mr. Keith De Silva. Welcome. So with that, we are going to start with Professor Lee, if you can provide your opening remarks to the members, and then we will go to, is it Dr. De Silva? To Dr. De Silva after that. Okay. So, Mr. Lee, please.
Thank you, Chair Fonseca. First, my disclosures. Number one, I do not belong to, or donate money to any political party at any level in Canada. Two, I have taught at Carleton University for 37 years, teaching the strategy capstone course that evaluates the competitiveness and value creation of industries and firms across the United States and Canada. Number three, over the last 30 years, I've taught over 100 times in EMBA in multiple developing countries that experience very low economic growth, massive inequality, corruption, and poverty at levels not seen in Canada. As I am not here to plead on behalf of any interest group, business, or NGO, after all, I'm not a lobbyist, I will deal at the level of macroeconomic philosophical direction with the budget implementation bill. The fundamental problem, in my judgment, with the previous budget and the current budget is the overarching belief in the following fundamental principles. Number one, belief in the top-down or centralized decision-making by politically directed non-market bureaucracy using public funds of citizens produces superior outcomes to decentralized private decision-making by investors taking risks with their own money. Two, superior economic growth and prosperity will be realized through expanding the role and size of the public sector to direct and guide and substitute their decisions for private strategic decisions by corporations and investors. Three, fairness is defined as treating business investors or risk takers as equal or possibly inferior to employees, requiring taxation to equalize investors with employees. In my judgment, each of these fundamental assumptions in the budget bill are wrong, false, and destructive of the greater public good in Canada. From the origins of the market economy in the late 1700s to the present, 250 years of economic theory and practice, over 50 Nobel Prizes in economics, has taught us that a decentralized economy of private investors and decision makers making private decisions concerning capital investment, research and development, production, pricing, distribution, and innovation produce the incredible standard of living of the high-income OECD countries documented by the World Bank. The hockey stick of prosperity, which was named and documented by growth scholar Professor McCloskey of University of Chicago and University of Illinois in over 250 peer-reviewed research articles. I urge you to read her one article called How Growth Happens. But it was Joseph Schumpeter, the brilliant economist at University of Vienna and then Harvard, who taught us the why and the how. Competition causes firms to endlessly, ceaselessly innovate in order to differentiate their product service offerings to achieve a sustainable competitive advantage, the holy grail of any private firm. This process creates gales of creative destruction, the famous phrase of Schumpeter. It is not profit maximization claimed by critics unschooled in growth theory and economic philosophy. Schumpeter taught us there's 5 types of innovation: product innovation, process innovation, business model innovation, source of supply innovation, and mergers and divestments, I would call it corporate strategy innovation. The budget unwittingly undermines every type of Schumpeterian innovation by attempting to displace and replace private producer or investor strategic decision-making concerning these types of innovations and replace the private investors with the very worst kind of economic policy decision-making, political decision-making, with false assumptions concerning the superiority of knowledge, understanding, and decision-making in private markets. Yet in any large economy, there are literally trillions of economic decisions that occur daily. Many are as trivial as the decision to go to Tim Hortons for a coffee. It's an economic decision. However, the trillions of microeconomic individual decisions aggregate to macroeconomic trends and macro consumer behavioral trends, the domain of strategy and value creation. It is a conceit that people at the top of the non-market sector possess superior knowledge to the wisdom of crowds and the outcomes of thousands of markets, reflecting the decisions of millions of consumers and investors. There is no factual basis to this conceit. There is no supercomputer in the world fast enough or powerful enough or AI algorithm or great leader smart enough who can process, aggregate, and understand the meaning of the trillions of economic decisions in real time and then respond with the appropriate strategies and policies. This explains the failure of every centrally managed economy everywhere. And we don't even have to look to the famous USSR. We can look at the failures of Argentina. We can look at the failures of Turkey, the failures of Venezuela. So what must be done? Because I'm running out of time.
Professor,
So
Professor Lee, we got to wrap it up. 10 seconds.
Can I just give you my 5 what must be dones?
No, we're well over. So I've let it go, but I got to.
I want to challenge the chair.
Listen, Professor Lee, you'll have a lot of time during questions, as you know from the members. Yeah. So, and the more, and yeah. Okay. So now we're going to the Canadian Association of Public Health Dentistry, and Dr. De Silva, please.
It's the end of the day, I get it. So thank you to the chair and to the committee for having me here today. I was more than happy to trade in the snow from Saskatoon for the rain here in Ottawa this morning. So my name is Keith De Silva, and I'm right now the only duly trained pediatric dentist and dental public health specialist. So it kind of gives me a unique perspective of both the private and the public side. And I'm the past president of the Canadian Association of Public Health Dentistry, and you heard from our president earlier today. In that role, I was fortunate to be a part of a number of different task force and working groups, and still am as it relates to the CDCP. So I've been involved with this from the start. I wanted to start by acknowledging and appreciating really the magnitude of this moment. This is a historic investment into oral health care, and one that will have the potential to improve the health and quality of life of a lot of Canadians who can't afford care. What I also don't want to lose in this moment, and I don't think we're talking about it enough, is there is widespread recognition for really the first time in the media, in public platforms, even in committee meetings like this, that oral health is an integral component of our overall health. It's something that we can't lose anymore, and it's really a paradigm shift that no matter what the policies or programs become, we can't undo that. We know that this is important for our overall health. As a clinical pediatric dentist, most of my practice really was a safety net. So I would treat children who would come from low-income families, and this used to be in Toronto, who couldn't be treated anywhere else. And whether that was because they were too young or their behavior couldn't allow them to sit in a chair, or because there were other practices who could not take the insurances that they were on due to reimbursement rates. It really was a difficult time for a lot of these children, especially in Ontario, where the fees were somewhere in the 30 to 40% range being reimbursed. These were children who had a mouthful of cavities, who often required us to take them to the operating room to have all their teeth fixed. And aside from the risks that come with treating children under general anesthesia, it's also a costly and inefficient way to have your teeth fixed. And it really does strain the overall hospital system. I also care for a lot of children with special needs. These are also individuals who have many challenges accessing care, and I believe you heard from Joan Rush today about that. And that could be, again, due to their coverage, financial resources, lack of specialized facilities, or really just the training and comfort level that some providers have because they don't have the expertise to do it. So my experience providing care for these children and their families is really what led me from pediatric dentistry to incorporate dental public health, because you really couldn't overlook some of the barriers that they were facing in coming to see or coming to get treatment. While my clinical focus is on pediatrics, in public health, I have expanded to address access to care for seniors, particularly in long-term care facilities for all low-income individuals, and in Saskatchewan, where I currently am, those living in northern areas of the province. Without a question, cost of care is the most profound barrier right now to oral health care, and no individual should ever have to choose between paying rent, buying groceries, or having a tooth fixed when it comes down to it. And so I do believe that the $13 billion investment into the plan will make dental care more affordable for a lot of Canadians, particularly those who've been priced out of the private system. However, I must emphasize that the launch of this plan and the investment into this plan should be looked at as the initial step of what will be a long road going forward to improve oral health outcomes. Of particular concern for us is that although care will become more affordable for a lot, it doesn't always mean it's going to become more accessible. there will still be many Canadians who enroll in the program who don't have dentists living in their communities or oral health care providers in their communities, and so they will still have to travel, or they don't have access to the specialized care that they need. Again, this is meant to be a start. We can't solve every problem in one plan, but things that we don't want to lose. We will still need to do more to incentivize members of the oral health care team and the full team. That includes specialists, dental hygienists, denturists, and dental therapists, to get them where they're needed the most, as well as making support training and educating the next generation of professionals. I'm optimistic that the Oral Health Care Access Fund will address some of these issues with some creative solutions going forward. So before concluding, I just wanted to leave you with 3 kind of points, and I'm sure many of these have been addressed today. The first is we still need to do a better job at emphasizing prevention. Both public and or private plans by design are geared towards diagnostic and treatment services, but they're very light on actually preventing disease. We still need to develop, and again, this doesn't have to be solved in any one plan, but a system of surveillance, health promotion, and prevention. I truly believe from my own experience that we can keep kids out of the emergency room and hospital rooms with a more targeted approach to prevention. There's lots more to be done with this plan to evaluate it in real time, and this is the harder part, actually making changes as we get more data. Some of the initial questions that will need to be addressed include, are the right services covered? Is there an evidence base for these services? Are Canadians enrolling in the program? And if not, what are the barriers to that? And those who are enrolled, are there difficulties accessing services, and how do we fix that? Lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this plan will not succeed without the acceptance of the full scope of all dental professionals, and there are still some barriers there to that. I'm very encouraged by the level of engagement. I don't think there's been this many stakeholder meetings and engagement with all the national professions and provincial professions, at least before. So there is progress in that. And although there are barriers, I do think they can be overcome over time, but there is still work to be done. So in closing, I thank you for allowing me to speak here today.
Thank you, Dr. De Silva, and I know the members are eager to ask questions, so we're going to start with our first round. Each of the parties will have up to 6 minutes to ask you questions. We are starting with MP Holland for the first 6 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Lee, thank you for being here. The Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, and the Bank of Canada all at one point said interest rates would be low for a very long time. After saying that, we saw 40-year highs in inflation. We saw the most aggressive interest rate hikes seen in Canadian history. In a BNN Bloomberg interview during that time, you had talked about how much there was unprecedented government spending that happened, and you predicted much of what we're seeing today with the high interest rates at being at to 5%. You used a term that you said that it was a government engineered, and it would get to this point. Can you expand a little bit on what happened? Because I think a lot of mortgage holders today that are renewing at double or triple the rate, or the ones that can't afford their mortgage today, want to know what happened.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. I did say that at that very time. This wasn't Monday morning quarterbacking 4 years later when they drove the rates down to 1/4 point, and government, the minister, the finance minister, and the prime minister were saying, borrow, they're going to stay at these levels. I instantly realized that they had made a mistake, because let me explain why. Rates, I went and did my research. Rates had never, ever in the history of Canada or the United States gone down to 1/4 point. I went all the way back to the U.S. Civil War, and they never went down to 1/4 point. And in Canada, in the Great Depression, which was 10 years, much longer than the pandemic, and 1/3 of the population out of work, and it didn't go down to 1/4. My point being that they were so low, it was inevitable that the rates were going to go up. It was not possible by any rational analysis of the historical record of interest rates that they would remain at basically zero. And so I was very critical of that, and I lived through the 70s when rates went to 20% to deal with the inflation of the then government of the time that hit 14%.
Thank you. You talked about productivity. We see in Canada here, GDP per person is declining for 6 straight quarters. GDP per capita is the lowest in growth in the entire OECD. The Bank of Canada's senior deputy governor, Carolyn Rogers, has said that this is a break glass emergency situation. Can you explain how did productivity get so bad in Canada, and why is it lower today than it was in 2018? And what the impact of some of the economic uncertainty and higher taxes have on that productivity?
Thank you again, Mr. Lawrence. I've been talking about this in my classes for literally 35 years. I've been studying and read, I think, every major document in our country on this topic, going all the way back to the 70s and the 80s. I've come to the conclusion, I agree with the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. I think that the lack of reduced competition, because we have so many protected industries, is a major contributor. I'm not suggesting it's the only contributor, but this is straight out of Schumpeter again. If you're not forced to compete, then you're not going to compete. You're not going to innovate. Why would you innovate if you don't have to innovate? And so we have created protection, a lot of protection in multiple industries, which is allowing these industries not to innovate. And to your second question, again, the research on this is very, very clear. Displacing and crowding out the private markets with government spending that's classified as investment is not going to, at least in any of the evidence I have seen, is not going to increase productivity. We have a crisis in this country, and it's not just the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. David Dodge has talked about this. John Manley, the former Liberal, has talked about this. Bill Morneau has talked about it. So this is not a quote, conservative view. It's the numbers are shouting at us that we have a profound problem that's going to hurt our young people.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. I have, I think, enough time for one more question. I wanted to talk about something that you brought up in another BNN Bloomberg interview when you said during the pandemic how untargeted universal government programs are squandering Canada's resources. We know Canadians are in a cost of living crisis right now. This government is constantly creating big government programs. A lot of the government's existing and announced programs don't increase productivity or make Canada more expensive or create jobs. What effect do you think these large programs have on affordability and productivity in Canada?
Thank you again. I have been very critical of them, and not because I was opposed to helping people that need help. Of course we do. That is the Canadian way. We've been doing this my entire life. As my late mother, who grew up in the Depression in Saskatchewan, reminded me, there was no public health care. There was no old age pension in the 30s. There was none of the programs we have now. This is not about dismantling the social programs for our people that need help. But universality, which is giving money to high-income people and upper-middle-class people like professors, is just simply wrong. It is just wrong to say I should be getting free medicine from the taxpayer when I have a private insurance plan. We should be targeting it to people who need help at the bottom, not privileged people like members of parliament and professors and public servants. That's squandering scarce, desperately scarce public funds when we should be targeting it just on there and then focusing on growth to create the economy and the growth of the future that's going to generate, by the way, tax revenues to the governments to then redistribute on various consumption programs.
Marty.
Lee, so MP Howland has one final question. Oh, no. It's going to MP Morantz. Yeah.
1 minute? Okay.
One question.
Professor, in my 1 minute, I want to ask you if you agree with the following statement. A quote from Milton Friedman. A society that puts equality ahead of freedom will end up with neither. A society that puts freedom ahead of equality will end up with a high degree of both. Do you agree with that, and do you think it applies to Canada today?
I do. I certainly studied Milton Friedman when I started my master's and my PhD. I went back as a mature student at the age of 30. I'm a high school dropout, by the way. I was really stupid and irresponsible when I was a teenager. So I learned my lesson. I realized education is the key, and I studied Milton Friedman. I also studied a lot of the thinkers that were in that period of the 80s, the economic deregulation reference of the Economic Council, because this was all very fertile times. But yes, there is, and I've taught in former communist countries, former centrally planned economies, and I don't believe you can have one without the other. They are joined at the hip.
Thank you. Thank you, MP Morantz. To MP Zerowitz, please.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I want to say thanks to both of our speakers today. My first question is to Dr. De Silva. Although you kind of ruined it by sort of on your end of your talk, you sort of talked about your 3 recommendations. So I'm going to be touching on one of them. When I was a kid, long ago, but not too long ago, we could not afford for me to go to a dentist. And so I would say a lot of people at my school could not afford a dentist. Every year we would have public health nurses come, and they were trained in dental hygiene. They would come and teach us how to brush our teeth. And they would do that every year. They would show us a couple, like a video and a couple of slides, and they literally would give us a toothbrush, and they would tell us how to brush our teeth, and they would walk up in rows in the gym to make sure that we were doing it properly. Then what they would do is they would individually, I think there must have been a dentist there, because I remember individually going up to the dentist and them looking at each of our mouths. And then what we would do is the next day, you would get either a yellow paper or red paper. And the red paper meant you should really see a professional dentist, which said you need braces. Every year, I always kind of cringed because every year I got a red slip of paper. But I knew there's no way I was going to show it to my parents because there's no way we could have afforded dentists. It sounds like a sad story, but the good news is I never had a cavity until I was 21 years old. And so, and I'd also say to you, because my parents had no money, we actually, I don't know if they meant to fool us, but they fooled us. They told us that dessert only ever happened on Sundays. So we only ever had sugar on Sundays. And I think that played a big role into why I had my very first cavity when I was 21 years old. Anyways, the question I have for you is, how do we ensure that we have a continued emphasis on prevention and keeping your teeth healthy while we are introducing this really excellent Canadian National Dental Care Plan?
So thank you for that. School-based systems, I think, have always shown to work for finding kids who are in high needs. And some provinces have targeted school-based programs where they go to schools in areas where they know the risk is going to be higher. In Ontario, some areas, for example, might have screening as well as fluoride varnishes applied. Some, depending on the scope of practice for the dental hygienist or dental therapist, can offer treatments within the schools. Saskatchewan used to have probably one of the most world-renowned school-based programs through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the challenge is they are costly to run. And given all the pressures that provinces also have, those tend to be cut first or stripped down first. So again, it's the idea that there needs to be parallel systems, within the provinces, within local municipalities. This requires partnerships with school boards, but not just focusing on children as well. So we do a pretty good job with oral health prevention and screening for our younger kids, particularly kindergarten up to grade 7. Once they hit high school, we kind of lose track of that. And then even more so for seniors in long-term care, where we're not going in there to assess their needs as readily. So I think it's combining resources where, it doesn't just have to be the oral health professionals involved in this. We need to partner with any caregiver, so nurses, physicians, where they can, to be looking in the mouth to identify problems so they can get to the system, whether it's through a private care, be referred to their dentist or enrolled into a public program. So it's kind of broadening how we get patients into the programs that they need, where they can get the care. But it starts by looking in the mouth, whether it's in the schools or in the areas where it's needed the most.
Thank you. So I just say to ourselves, let's not lose that. I think that's very important. I actually think that the reason it was done when I was younger was the only thing that could be afforded by the school system, by the healthcare system then. And so it didn't cost a lot of money. And I just would say we want to do that. And I'll say to you that whatever I learned in grade school, I very much carry through in high school. And anyway, so I just want to say that as a reminder to ourselves. And thank you for your leadership, by the way. Really appreciate all the work that you've done. My second question is to Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, you might be the most invited guest to Finance Committee. I've been on this committee for almost 4 years now, and I think I've seen you at just about every single study. We're here actually to talk about the fall economic statement. And so I wanted to ask you a question. We have heard from a number of industry guests who have come before us to talk on the fall economic statement, they very much support the investment tax credit, and they have been very vocal in saying, get going in terms of approving the fall economic statement and C-59. Would you agree with them?
Yes, because the uncertainty that would be caused if you literally threw out the fall budget, which was a year ago, essentially, it would cause too much economic disruption. I proposed, I didn't have time to deliver what I recommended. There are things that can be done to deal with our productivity crisis and economic growth. And so I would focus on those larger, more macroeconomic policies that focus on investment and economic growth.
Well, thank you. I'm glad our government's doing one thing right with these investment tax credits. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MP Zarowitz. MP Samari, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc, je remercie les témoins de...
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony. My questions will be for Mr. Lee. Thank you for your presentation and your expose. Now, this, in conjunction with C-59, you said that your comments were generally macroeconomic, general comments, but we're also within C-59 and other bills, we do look at the Competition Act. What should be the normative regulatory structure in an economy in order to sustain competitiveness?
Very much for that question. I didn't expect it, but I'm really pleased you asked it. I think we've made a mistake, and I say that with great respect towards the Competition Bureau. There are some very fine people there, but we've engaged in what I call nose counting. You know, how many companies are in, what's the concentration ratio, and I use concentration ratios in my courses too. But to go back to Schumpeter, who understood this more deeply, I believe, than anyone else, he argued it wasn't the concentration ratio that's critical, it's the contestability of markets. How easy is it to enter the market with substitutes? That's where competition increasingly comes from. Jeff Bezos taught us that. He's deconstructed the retail physical bricks and mortar because he had a brilliant idea in 1995. He understood you can sell stuff online when everybody was laughing at him. And so it's contestability that's critical, not looking at the existing status quo. You know, it's like looking in the rearview mirror. So that's my overarching philosophical criticism, is that we should be saying, how can we make all of these enclosed markets more contestable, whether it's airlines or banking or other areas that are protected?
Merci pour la réponse.
Well, thank you for that answer. In all courses of microeconomy, we always identify barriers to entry as a very pivotal item. So we should look at the overall look at of the law, and I thank you for that question. Another aspect of C-59 deals with major corporations to make use of tax havens, tax avoidance. What's your opinion on tax havens?
I've looked at the literature because this is important. The OECD, it started under, that would have been Mr. Kretsch's administration and Bill Clinton in the States when they got the OECD moving on this. So give them credit. But I do want to distinguish between tax havens and just good old-fashioned illegal cheating. Okay, I think it's important. But I'm going to focus just very quickly because of time to your question. I think the availability of tax havens is diminishing because of the OECD tax treaty that Canada's belonged to, because of the increased scrutiny by media on it, and so I don't see it as a large issue for conventional publicly traded companies that are very worried about their brand and their reputation. And we've also dealt with the competition between countries by setting a minimum corporate income tax. So I think this issue is diminishing in importance.
Je vous remercie pour votre réponse à ce sujet.
Thank you very much for your answer on that topic. I'd like to come back to the monetary policy of the Bank of Canada and the Fed in the States. You contend that we should never have reduced the interest rates to such a low degree, if I understood you correctly. And what are your criteria, your critique, or your comments on the Canadian bank's central bank as compared to the American one?
I don't want anyone to think, well, you're just a professor, sitting in the ivory tower. I do read. I promise you, I do study this intensely. And Mohamed El-Erian, the very distinguished chief economist, formerly with PIMCO and now with one of the major European financial institutions, was extremely critical of this. He said they drove them far too low. So was Lawrence Summers, because we knew what would happen. It's when you cut interest rates to that level, it is the same as a very steep tax cut. You're introducing huge amounts of stimulus. We tend to think of stimulus as only fiscal and not monetary. So what had happened? Well, people did exactly what we should expect them to do. They went out and borrowed like there was no tomorrow. And I think that we didn't cause inflation, but we certainly the inflation was, as we all know, caused by the shutting down of the supply chains. But we certainly exacerbated inflation. Very quickly to your question, I do support the interest rate increase because I don't believe that there's any other effective tool in all the Western countries that have studied this. It's a blunt, harsh tool, but it works. And I lived through it when interest rates hit 20%, and we killed inflation under Governor Bowie and Governor Volcker. They brought inflation from 14% down to zero, basically.
Je vous remercie beaucoup pour les réponses. J'aurais probablement.
Well, thank you for your answers. I hope to get a second turn, and I'll ask you some more.
Davies, please.
Thank you. Mr. De Silva, or Dr. De Silva, you have said the availability of dental care for individuals with developmental disabilities can be problematic due to a shortage of dentists and dental hygienists who are willing or trained to provide treatment to this group. What are the principal barriers preventing dentists and dental hygienists from providing treatment to individuals with developmental disabilities?
So I think for many it's, again, a lack of exposure during training to deal with the complex issues or the complex medical needs that many individuals with disabilities have. So when there's that comfort level that may deter them from realizing that they can, with practice or with mentorship, work that, because it's not really structured into the education or postgraduate training unless you're in a specific specialty that deals with it. There could also be some physical barriers in terms of equipment, in terms of specialized chairs that can accommodate wheelchairs, or a lack of access to hospital service where a lot of these individuals need to be. Lots of hospital time or dental departments within hospitals have been cut over time, and so it's just very hard to get them there.
To give me an idea of the scope of the problem, if you can, what portion of Canadians with developmental disabilities currently lack access to dental coverage?
I don't know if I've ever seen a national survey or a percentage on that, but I would imagine it would be pretty high. Almost 60 to 70% would have some challenges, whether it's through transportation, accessibility within an office, or finding that provider within a reasonable range from where they are.
And to what degree do the funding levels provided by existing public programs derogate from provincial dental fee schedules?
For special needs or just general? So
both.
Any public. So it varies by province. Some of the lowest I've seen could be in the 30 to 40% range. I've seen some provinces, Saskatchewan, for example, that's in the 70 to 80% range. So it does vary quite considerably. And that really depends on how often each province or each payer of that plan reevaluates their fees and reinvests into it. So some are worse than others, we'll say.
Now, it's my understanding that most plans, whether they're private or provincially delivered, provide inadequate funding for sedation, general anesthesia services, or extra units of time for say, nonverbal patients or patients, which are often required by individuals with developmental disabilities. What advice would you give us as we develop the CDCP in that regard?
So it's again, so individuals with disabilities, their needs are more complex, and so the plans should reflect that. So, most of the codes, based on time, it almost takes twice as much time to deal with some of these patients. And we see that with pediatric patients as well, even healthy ones, where it may take more time for them. So the standard kind of formulas that may be used to decide fees, if there is a time component, it needs to be adjusted for the extra needs that some patients have. And that could be, as well for seniors or those with more issues.
Professor Lee, if I could, if I caught your testimony correctly, you said, and I think I'm quoting, inflation was caused by the shutting down of supply chains. Is that what you think is the principal cause of inflation and not deficits?
Deficits contribute to inflation over time, I believe. But in this specific context, we had stable inflation from 1981 until the pandemic, and then we shut down for whatever reason. We know the reason. We shut down the supply chains, and we didn't realize how complex they are. I believe we thought it was this: we just turn on a switch and they just all flow back in and everything's fine. And so in that instance, it was shutting down the supply chains. But if you're asking about deficits because you are, we've seen countries, Argentina's Exhibit A, where you let your deficits get out of control. And yes, it can.
Well,
Friedman won about that.
Yeah.
About that.
The country that I'm thinking of is the United States, which right now is performing much, much stronger economically than Canada and has a deficit. I've seen figures between 6 and 8 times higher as a percentage. So how do you explain that?
I do. I talk about it all the time. Mm-hmm. The United States, I talk about it in my classes all the time, believe me. The United States is sui generis, unique. It is truly in a class of its own. It is the world superpower and the world reserve currency because it has the largest economy in the world. And they can do things that us ordinary mortals cannot do in other countries.
Thank you. How am I doing for time?
You got another minute.
So, Professor Lee, I'm old enough to remember the 1980s. So in the 1980s, we saw the birth of what was called neoliberal economics. We saw the introduction of that I think has continued to this day. We've had lower corporate taxes. We pursued liberalized trade, signing trade agreements, removing most tariffs. We had pursued deregulation in everything from the airlines, where we sold off Air Canada and deregulated the airlines. We sold off Petro-Canada. We have fewer regulations today, certainly, than we did in the 1980s. Yet spending on machinery and equipment by businesses and on R&D and innovation in Canada has been falling as a share of GDP, dating right back to the beginning of the century. Can you explain that to me?
I think I can. Forgive my arrogance. Again, I've read a ton on this. And I've come to the conclusion, I think Deputy Governor Rogers has too. I think David Dodge has and many others. But I've come to the conclusion it's because we have too many protected industries. We don't even have free trade in Canada between the provinces. The IMF estimates that if we had genuine free trade between BC, Ontario, et cetera, it would be the equivalent of a 22% tariff reduction. I mean, that's massive. Massive in terms of the impact on GDP. So we've met the enemy, and it's us. We've done it to ourselves. Our banking is protected. Our airlines are protected. The fees are twice as large. I mean, dairy is protected, as we all know, through supply management. We have many protected industries, and I'm as cynical about business as any progressive, and I'm not a progressive. I'm a fiscal conservative. I don't hide it. But corporations will not
we noted that.
they don't have to. Yes. Corporations will not compete if they don't have to. We've got to make them compete. Open it up. Remove all protection for these companies.
Thank you, and that's the time, MP Davies. So we got a little bit more. Everybody, you want more? We've got another 10-minute-ish or so. So about 2 or 3 minutes. MP Chambers, please, and
thanks very much.
You'll have an opportunity.
Dr. De Silva, I just want to. If we could talk about program design. The dental care program today doesn't have a lot of dentists signed up for it. Do you think it would have been more advantageous to use the existing provincial programs that were already had dentists signed up across the country to deliver the same benefit?
I think at least anecdotally from having worked in Ontario and now in Saskatchewan, if it was a carbon copy of the provincial plans, you may actually have less dentists wanting to be involved. There's just a historic distrust between provincial plans and the dental profession because they've only ever been clawed back and have. So that's where the kind of issue with administrative burden comes from, is having to deal with a lot of these provincial plans.
Okay.
So I think there's some optimism for the
Okay.
federal.
Would it surprise you to learn that $1 billion of the spend is going to administration?
Never heard that, but I
$750 million is going to Sun Life, and almost $200 million is going to Health Canada.
Knowing, again, in my public health work, I've done evaluation of a lot of plans, and so I know that's a realistic cost in terms of development because of the upfront infrastructure that has to be in place, particularly on the timeline to get this out there.
Okay. We've heard testimony, and it's been reported in the news, that some employers are trying to carve out those that will become eligible for the plan. Do you think that's a concern?
I do, in our current system, I do think it is because at least the projection for those who will enroll is based on the idea that there are many with private coverage within those income ranges.
Right.
And so I don't know if there is the capacity at this time should private plans or employment-based insurance start to disappear. And I think that was one of the earlier points made when it was first launched in some of the groups that, you know, that could be,
uploading of costs. There's also some provinces who are advocating the role now. If you had a patient, or if you hypothetically were advising a patient who had a private plan, who called you and said, you know, there's a new federal plan, should I leave my current private coverage and join the public plan? What would you advise them to do?
I would probably tell them to continue on as they are with that, because they're more familiar with what they have. And again, it's, you know, there are some private plans that actually cover less as a percentage than some of the public plans, but at the same time, it's still very new in terms of what's covered, what's not. So they have their existing plan, their services that they're comfortable with to keep that.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chair.
Thank you, MP Chambers. Now to MP Baker for about 2-3 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to come back to Mr. Lee, if I could, just on the topic of competition. I'm of the view that we talked a lot about competition here at this committee, and in particular, and you mentioned it, my view is we don't have enough competition in a few sectors in this country. Airlines comes to mind, telecommunications comes to mind, banking comes to mind. I think you mentioned one or two of those in an earlier response. So what will we have to do to meaningfully increase competition in those three sectors?
Thank you. Please believe me, thank you. We have to remove the legislative protections that protect those firms against external competition. And I know there are people who say, oh my goodness, I'm unionized, by the way, at the university. And I hear union colleagues saying, oh my goodness, if they come in, we're going to create massive unemployment. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I lived through Balcerowicz when he did the cold shock therapy of 1993-95. And Poland was destitute, poverty, bankrupt, and in 24 months, they went through a deep recession for sure. And then Poland took off, and there's no other country the IMF has ruled, as evaluated, that has been as successful in the post-communist era as Poland. And they adopted all these pro-market reforms that we're talking about. So we've got to open it up. I don't believe that there'll be mass unemployment. The new entrants will employ those Canadians that are laid off by Bell or by Rogers. That's great. Or the other industries that are opened up. So it's going to create growth and create productivity. It's not going to create unemployment. If we open them up and remove those legislative prohibitions against foreign firms coming in, let Verizon come into Canada.
So can I ask you specifically about airlines? Because the example that's been raised by people is we should allow, like, all of these sectors we've just talked about have significant barriers to entry.
Yes,
but I want to focus on airlines. Is that mean, are you recommending open skies in Canada? Like United Airlines, American Airlines, et cetera, should come in and be able to fly point to point in Canada? So Toronto, Vancouver,
Yes.
Toronto, Montreal, whatever the case may be, whatever routes they so choose?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I have been challenged by this and said, we'll lose our Canadian identity. I've flown on Lufthansa, and I've never learned how to speak German. I've flown on Aeroflot, and I've never learned to speak Russian. I have not been assimilated by flying on other airlines just because it has a foreign flag on it. We will not lose our Canadian identity just because I'm in Hilton Head. I flew on United Airlines to get here, and I'm every bit as Canadian as the day I left.
Well, is that my time?
You could just keep it.
I was just getting.
A comment?
I was just getting started. Okay. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, MP Baker. We were wondering where you were, Mr. Lee. Yeah, Hilton Head. Okay, so we're at MP Samari, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et moi,
Thank you, Chair. I've taken Air Canada or any other airline. I didn't get better service in French anyway. You often refer to Schumpeter, and you even talked about creative destruction. Can you draw a parallel between the concepts put forward by Schumpeter and the collectivization of various processes going on with AI, artificial intelligence?
Talked about this long before we just suddenly discovered it in the current contemporary era, that there's a tendency to oligopoly in new industries. And so we get all concerned about that. And all I can remind everybody what Schumpeter said: there is no such thing as a permanent monopoly. All monopolies break down if you allow entry and you reduce barriers to entry, because some smart entrepreneur out there will figure out a way to go around the oligopolist or the monopolist because they're making so much money. And so that's why the creative destruction comes from these innovative attempts to smash the existing market power of existing large players. So I'm not worried about AI dominating technology. I'm not worried about Meta. Their competitors will emerge. Apple is already losing market share in their phones. So competition will address it if they're allowed to.
à la fin de sa vie,
Towards the end of his career and his life, Schumpeter seemed to become a bit cynical on the bureaucracy, and if we were to follow that process, I think, do you share his vision that perhaps I'm misinterpreting his philosophy or his approach?
Referring to his final book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. But that was a cultural interpretation. He said capitalism is the most efficient form of all, but it will be destroyed because of what he called the sociology of the intellectual. People like me, well, not me literally, but that intellectuals don't like markets. We don't like business. We don't like competition. And all you have to do is listen to any professor on CBC or on CTV or Global, and about 98% of them will verify that. So we have this hostility, deep philosophical opposition. And for those who say I'm wrong, please read The Sociology of the Intellectual. It's chapter 6 in his Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, the most brilliant exposition ever of how intellectuals and why intellectuals think the way they do.
donc l'ennemi de l'entreprise.
So the enemy of the entrepreneur, the innovator, is a unionized professor, I suppose. Thank you.
MP Davies, you will get the final 3 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Silva, I think we all want to make sure that people living with disabilities in this country who have been marginalized, and we've heard very clearly from you and others, have a tough time accessing all health care, but, in this case, dental care. If you could give this committee and this government any advice, tell me what you think we should do to address that in the most effective way.
I think you'll see a lot of this come out with the Oral Health Access Fund proposals, but one of the challenges I faced as a pediatric dentist, my specialty area is with children, but I treat all adults with special needs because once they turn 18 or 19, I have nowhere to send them for that. But some of the work they need is outside of my scope in terms of denture care or implants and things like that. So there needs to be a pipeline in terms of training program and mentorship for young professionals to realize that they can treat these patients first. They can be a part of the team, whether it's just screening, basic care and prevention through that. I think we also need to improve access to hospital care for those who really need it. Sedation is becoming maybe a little too popular for a lot of patients, and some of the patients with more medical complex needs are on the same waiting lists for that. So really looking into creating more specialized hospital departments to care for those that need those services.
We've seen in the primary healthcare field with physicians the emergence of nurse practitioners, and I'm aware of the dental therapist position. Do you see an expanded role for dental therapists as perhaps the development of a professional that can bridge that gap between a dental assistant and a hygienist and a dentist that maybe might be able to target care for these?
I absolutely hope so. So right now, I think it's only Saskatchewan and maybe a few provinces on federal land where dental therapists can practice. So we have a new training program in Saskatchewan so that workforce will be reinvigorated, but we need pathways for licensure for them across Canada. But again, they are those who can